Hello, my name is Dan Sokulski. I'm a recovery support specialist at Chestnut Health Systems in Bloomington, Illinois. And I'm here today on behalf of the McLean County ROSC, Recovery Oriented Systems of Care. Just want to talk a little bit about some of the history of recovery in the West. We'll have some sort of supplemental videos that drill more into some of the things, more details into what we'll be talking about here. So this is kind of a broad overview, touching on some of the things that happened in the 1700s, some of the temperance movement, some of the main actions, I guess, in the 1800s. But most of the focus is going to be from 1908 to 1939, when the Alcoholics Anonymous Big Book was published. And we'll just kind of get going and see how it goes here. And like I said, if there's anything that you want to learn more about that I sort of fly over, just check us for other videos, and there's probably going to be videos that go more into more depth about those topics. As a lot of us know, before Alcoholics Anonymous came around in 1935, there was very little hope for alcoholics, people suffering with addiction, and there's all sorts of barbaric ways that people tried to cure it over the duration of time, whether it be bloodletting, bleeding people out, drilling holes in people's brains, electroshock therapy, inducing comas. A lot of these things were meant to help people and cure their condition, but ultimately just led them to a speedier death. So the really part of why this is important is just to show, when you think about the entire spectrum of time, mankind on this planet, how little piece have we actually had a solution, for people suffering in addiction and alcoholism. And I'll talk about alcohol a lot here, just because a lot of it sort of gets into some of the roots of AA, but in future videos we'll get more into Narcotics Anonymous, Cocaine Anonymous, Recovery Dharma, Smart Recovery, some of the other programs that have started since AA was founded. So really where we first see sort of documented movements to try and help alcoholism is in the 1700s with some of the Native Americans. And this is where we first hear about prayer for the alcoholic people in tribes. This was kind of the first area where we saw spirituality incorporated into it, rather than just, some sort of kind of blunt procedure to try and cure somebody. This is where they sort of look towards what we could call a higher power. And they use vision quests, nature walks, prayer circles, meditation, peyote, different ways to try and help these people. We'll get more into that in future videos. Going into the 1800s, some of the temperance movements, I'm just going to spotlight a couple of them. With the temperance movements is where we start to see the philosophical focus shift from moderation, or I guess what we would call today like harm reduction, to total abstinence. And one of the big ones is the Washingtonians, which started around the 1830s into the 40s. It basically was a group of about 20 guys in Baltimore who met regularly to drink in the local tavern, and then one day they decided that they were going to start a sort of temperance group and an abstinence group. And it was probably more just out of pride and who knows, maybe a bet or something. A lot of these were upper class type individuals, and some of the tenets behind the Washingtonians was they had public confession. So somebody would literally just get out into a group and they'd invite the media, town circle or something like that, and confess their problem. Then they'd make a public commitment to abstain from further drinking. The Washingtonians would bring in more established members to work with the newcomers. So we start seeing themes of service and one alcoholic helping another at this point. They'd offer them financial assistance, clothes, food, lodging, that kind of thing. They would participate in experience sharing, similar to what we might, consider like a mutual support group or a 12-step meeting, something along those lines today. Service to other alcoholics and sober entertainment. Those are all great things. Those are all things that we still practice today. Part of what was the undoing of this particular group was it was somewhat elitist. They charged membership fees. Not anybody could join it. There was obviously no anonymity. If anything, it was more of a public spectacle by bringing newspapermen to come document so and so admitting his alcoholism, and it ended up just kind of being sort of circus-like at times. And so those are some of the reasons why it did not gain traction. Later in the 19th century, we have the Keeley Leagues. Dr. Leslie Keeley from nearby in the Dwight, Illinois area, just about an hour north of where we are filming this today, had this Keeley cure, which was basically 4 daily injections of a gold chloride. They just called it gold injections. Gold had a lot of different uses in the medical field back in the day. So this Keeley cure, as it was dubbed, was not so effective. There was later some tests done on it as it sort of gained notoriety, I guess, and it was found to have, barbiturates and other, basically drugs that, would cause sort of cross addiction. So that wasn't too tenable. But the Keeley Leagues did have some good stuff. They introduced sober homes, where it was probably the closest thing that we'd ever seen up to that point of what we would consider treatment, where somebody would go into one of these sober homes for 30 days. And they, get on a better diet. They start clearing their mind. They get some, counseling type help. Staff workers who had been through recovery themselves, or who had walked the path before, would work there. So people would just start feeling better, start being introduced to other people trying to live a recovery lifestyle. So it definitely had its merits as well. And again, we'll do more videos in depth on a lot of this stuff. So I really want to kind of start picking up speed here. Let's kind of just setting the stage. Is 1908. There's this gentleman named Frank Buchman, and he is a secretary for a YMCA in Philadelphia, and he has this tremendous gift for helping young people. And he ends up starting a street-side church on a $17 donation. And the church does so well, it grows to the point where it has a board of trustees, and he's no longer calling all the shots because of the growth of the organization. And it's really cruising along. And then one day, he's meeting with his board members, and they slash his budget. And they basically tell Frank, you need to stop feeding these kids, steaks and seafood. They'll be fine on rice and beans. And Frank ends up really getting upset about this, and he quits his own church. He writes about, building this big resentment towards these 6 trustees in particular. And he ends up seeing his doctor, recognizing that he's suffering. He's just feeling depressed. And really what he later recognizes is he was suffering from spiritual deterioration, because he quit his own church. He was no longer connected with service and helping people get on their feet. And the doctor basically prescribes him to go to Europe to vacation. So that's the kind of thing that they used to do. And so he goes to England, and he's kind of toiling around, still not really finding much direction. And his parents eventually, let him know, hey, we're not just going to keep paying for you to, aimlessly live in England and not really do anything with your life. And so he goes to, makes these plans to see this Keswick convention one weekend, which was in England. And he was planning to see a particular preacher that he'd heard good things about, and it ends up that person cancels, and he sees another replacement preacher, Jesse Penn Lewis, fill it. They talk about, he writes how he ended up staying and listening, and he watches them speak about the power of surrendering your will, past, present, and future, to God. And he writes how he was transfixed on this cross behind Penn Lewis, as they were talking. And he sort of has this kind of spiritual experience and realizes that, he needs to make restitution to these people that he was harboring this resentment against. And what he basically does is writes a simple letter to each of the 6 trustees and mails it. And it's have a copy of the letter here. It says, "My dear friend, I'm writing to tell you that I have harbored unkind feelings towards you, and at times I have conquered them, but they always come back. Our views may differ, but as brothers we must love. I write to ask for forgiveness and say I love you, and trust by God's grace I shall never more speak unkindly or disparagingly of you." And he immediately talks about being unblocked by a sense of power through making this restitution as soon as he drops these letters in the mail. And even writes in a journal about, that very night after he mails them, there's somebody who's living outside of his flat or apartment who's just basically homeless, and he's able to help that gentleman on the spot, find a place to live, help him sort of, get his life pointed in the right direction, and he's, just sort of back in the game. And he goes to nearby Oxford University and starts recruiting the leaders of the student body, athletes, kind of the movers and shakers at Oxford University. And he creates this movement, which was called the Oxford Movement, fittingly. And it's based on the four absolutes of honesty, love, purity, and unselfishness. They even have 4 tenets of the Oxford Movement. And I'll read them here real quickly. And if you're familiar with the 12 steps, there is no 12 steps yet, there is no AA, but you'll recognize a lot of the same principles and actions in these 4 tenets of the Oxford Movement. 1 is share our sins and temptations with another Christian and give it to God. Use it to help others. 2, surrender our life, past, present, and future. 3, make restitution to all we'd harmed, directly and indirectly. 4, listening and accepting, we rely on God's guidance. And so Frank returned to the U.S. to build his Oxford Movement back home. It was gaining some tremendous traction in Europe. It was spreading all throughout Europe, even into parts of India and later Asia. And he goes back to Philadelphia, Penn State University in particular, to kind of, sort of replicate what he did at Oxford University at Penn State. And he's really just turned off by the rampant alcoholism and debauchery going on at that university, and it doesn't really gain much traction. And he has an old friend named Sam Shoemaker, who's an Episcopal minister on a mission in China. And he goes to visit him, 1, because they're friends, 2, Sam tells him he's having a tough time in China, and 3, he has interest in sort of expanding this Oxford movement that's been really flourishing over the last decade or so. Frank immediately recognizes that, Sam is suffering from resentment. And he tells him point blank. Sam doesn't even realize it himself. He's just kind of like, he hears it and he's like, you know what, you're right. I'm having trouble with the Chinese culture. I don't like the food. I don't understand the language. The communication's been difficult. Basically, I just don't like, China. Not so much the country, but his experience there. And Frank talks to him about his experience with, restitution being at sort of the root of his kind of spiritual revival. And Sam gets in front of the students where he's teaching in China and sort of apologizes to them and lets them know some of the stuff that's on their mind. And from things I've read, the students sort of burst out laughing because, they've recognized this all along, and they're just I guess glad to see that he admits it. So overall, Sam's experience in China isn't what he would deem a roaring success, but he does return to the United States and starts the first Oxford group in northern New York at the Calvary Church. And Oxford group, again, this deserves its own video. It was really around sort of like a blip on the radar of time, really from for the most part, the 1920s into the 30s, and then it started falling off in the late 30s. But without it, there's a good chance we might not have Alcoholics Anonymous. And without Alcoholics Anonymous, who knows what recovery would look like today. So it really does have, it really was an important landmark in this historical perspective if we're looking at recovery. And the Oxford group, basically, they had things called house parties where they would get together and share their experience, strength, and hope, which probably sounds familiar with anyone who's been to a 12-step meeting before. They had slogans like, "It works if you work it." And they had a focus on the new person, the newcomer, somebody coming in for the first time and making them feel welcome. and going to different people's homes to sort of have group participation and sharing rather than what was more common up to that point, which was these sort of tent shows or kind of touring preachers, coming into town, and everyone would gather to where that person was going to be speaking, and it was sort of just a one-sided monologue or presentation or speech or whatever, homily. So the Oxford group had a different perspective. Now, mind you, it wasn't a group for alcoholics. There were alcoholics, but it was really, we share our experience, strength, and hope so that we may help each other solve our common problems, okay? So it could be anything from a bad marriage to a boss you don't like to, your kids misbehaving. It covered the gamut. But it did, of course, have people, there for drinking too much, problem drinking or alcoholism or, problem with different substances. Although it was much more taboo then, so a lot of times that was kind of, obfuscated and for more superficial issues that people would talk about instead. And the Oxford group did spread into all the major cities, Denver, Chicago, Los Angeles, Houston, you name it. But they never really got backing from the broader church. It was called a first century Christian fellowship, so it made no bones about it. It was a religious organization. And they also sort of had a knack for their intent to make the newcomer feel welcome, sometimes turn people off. That was kind of a new thing, and in some ways it maybe sort of scared people away unintentionally. And there are some other issues as to why it basically ended up imploding. But for the most part, those are some of the basics, and we'll talk about that more in other videos.